The rain fell in thick sheets, pounding against the grimy sidewalks of Houston's Fifth Ward. A street lamp flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. In the corner of a dimly lit alley, a teenage boy stood, fists clenched, eyes dark with rage. George Foreman was no stranger to the night. He owned it, ruled it, prowled its corners like a king without a throne. He was a born fighter, not in the ring, but in the streets, where survival was measured in bruises and broken noses. The world hadn't given him a choice. He had to be tough, had to be mean. But deep inside, beyond the scowl and the clenched fists, there was a boy who had yet to learn the true nature of strength. The world first glimpsed that power in 1968, under the searing Mexican sun. Clad in red, white, and blue, Foreman stood in the Olympic ring, staring down a Soviet powerhouse. He was young, unpolished, but when his fists found their mark, the earth seemed to tremble. The final punch sent his opponent crumpling like a house of cards, and in that instant, the world knew. A monster had been unleashed. As the referee lifted his hand in victory, Foreman grabbed an American flag and waved it high. The crowd cheered, but he didn't feel their love. He never did. All he knew was the hunger, the need to be feared. And in the years to come, he would feed that hunger until it consumed him. With gold draped around his neck, he descended from the Olympic podium, not as a hero, but as a storm gathering over the horizon. He entered the world of professional boxing like a wrecking ball, breaking through opponents as if they were made of glass. His punches weren't just hard, they were biblical, the kind that could crack ribs and shatter wills. But the rage inside him remained unchecked, an unrelenting fire that even victory couldn't quench. He was undefeated, untouchable, unstoppable, and yet deep down, something festered. Something he couldn't name, but something he would one day have to face, not in the ring, but within himself. The world of professional boxing was a savage, unforgiving beast. It didn't care about dreams or redemption. It only respected violence. And George Foreman? He had plenty of it to give. One by one, his opponents fell like dominoes, crumpling under the sheer force of his blows. He didn't just win, he annihilated. His fists were wrecking balls, and his presence alone was enough to make lesser fighters crumble before the first bell. In the span of just a few years, he tore through the heavyweight division, racking up knockout after knockout, leaving a trail of battered bodies in his wake. But with every victory, his scowl grew darker, his hunger more insatiable. He was no longer fighting for survival, he was fighting for dominance. And in 1973, his moment arrived. The contract was signed. The world would witness an unstoppable force meet an immovable object. Joe Frazier, the undisputed heavyweight champion, the man who had conquered Muhammad Ali, stood in Foreman's path. The venue was Kingston, Jamaica. The world watched as the two men stepped into the ring, one a battle-hardened warrior, the other an uncaged beast. The bell rang, and within seconds, Foreman unleashed hell. The punches came like rolling thunder. Lefts, rights, uppercuts. Frazier, a champion known for his resilience, was lifted off the canvas by the sheer force of a Foreman uppercut. 6 times he fell. 6 times he tried to rise. And finally, the referee had seen enough. In just 2 brutal rounds, Foreman had done the impossible. He had destroyed the indestructible. And as the belt was placed around his waist, a new king was crowned. But power is a dangerous thing. The more he had, the more he craved. The adulation of the crowd? Meaningless. The respect of his peers? Insignificant. George Foreman didn't want to be liked. He wanted to be feared. He walked through the world like an executioner, his glare as lethal as his fists. His next challenger, Ken Norton, had broken Muhammad Ali's jaw. But Foreman, he broke Norton in 2 rounds. The pattern was the same. Step into the ring, deliver destruction, leave without a scratch. The world had never seen such dominance, and yet beneath it all, something still gnawed at him. He was the most feared man in boxing, but what lay beyond fear? He had conquered everything in his path, except himself. And soon he would come face to face with the one man who could bring his entire world crashing down. The world had never seen a fighter like George Foreman. He was more than just a champion, he was a force of nature. His reign of terror continued, and the heavyweight division trembled beneath his might. The whispers began to circulate. Was this man even beatable? Could anyone stand against the fury of Big George? But behind the steel exterior, behind the crushing knockouts, something sinister was brewing. He wasn't just destroying opponents, he was destroying himself. The hunger that had once driven him now poisoned him. He had power, fame, money, but why did it feel so empty? Why did every victory feel like a hollow echo in the darkness? The answer wouldn't come in the gym, nor in the roar of the crowd. It would come in the form of a man who had mastered something Foreman had never learned: control. Muhammad Ali. The very name was lightning in a bottle, a force that transcended boxing. He was the people's champion, the poet of the ring, the only man who could stand in the face of a storm and dance through the chaos. And now he was coming for Foreman. The world called it the Rumble in the Jungle. Zaire, 1974. The young lion against the old master. Foreman was bigger, stronger, more dangerous. The odds makers favored him heavily. Ali, they said, was finished. His time had passed. He was walking into a slaughter. But Ali had a plan. He always did. As the stadium filled with chants of, "Ali Bamaya! Ali Bamaya! Kill him, Ali!" Foreman felt something for the first time in years. Doubt. The bell rang, and Foreman charged like a war machine, unloading his full arsenal on Ali. The ring shook with the impact of his blows, but Ali didn't crumble. He didn't fall. Instead, he leaned back against the ropes, absorbing the storm, letting Foreman punch himself into exhaustion. The crowd gasped. What was Ali doing? Why wasn't he fighting back? Round after round, Foreman unleashed hell, and Ali whispered in his ear, taunting him, daring him to keep swinging. The beast had never been tamed before, until now. And then, in the 8th round, the world tilted. Ali, suddenly alive with fresh energy, unleashed a blinding combination. A right hand struck like a thunderbolt, and for the first time, Foreman felt the earth slip from beneath his feet. He went down. The undefeated giant, the most feared man in boxing, lay sprawled on the canvas, staring up at the African night sky. As Foreman lay on the canvas, his mind swirled in a daze. The invincible giant, the executioner of champions, had fallen. The referee's count echoed in his ears. 6, 7, 8. He tried to rise, but his legs betrayed him. The same legs that had carried him through wars, the same body that had wrecked titans, now felt like stone. The count reached 10. It was over. The king had been dethroned. The crowd erupted in hysteria as Muhammad Ali danced in triumph, arms raised to the heavens. Foreman had been beaten not just physically, but mentally. He had walked into the jungle as a monster and left as a man stripped of his armor. And the worst part? There were no excuses, no controversy, no robbery, just a bitter truth. Ali had outthought, outlasted, and outclassed him. Foreman left Zaire humiliated, his aura shattered, his legend in ruins. The whispers that once hailed him as an unstoppable force now turned against him. Maybe he was never that great. Maybe he was just a bully who finally met someone who wouldn't be bullied. He returned to the gym, his fists still heavy, but his spirit fractured. He tried to chase redemption, to fight his way back to the top. In 1976, he stepped into the ring with Ron Lyle, a man just as vicious, just as dangerous. The two gladiators traded knockdowns in one of the most brutal slugfests of all time. Foreman fell, Lyle fell. But in the end, George stood victorious. Yet even as his arm was raised in triumph, the cheers rang hollow. He had won, but he hadn't erased the ghost of Zaire. Then came Jimmy Young in 1977, a fight that should have been routine. But Foreman wasn't the same. His power remained, but his fire was dim. The fight dragged on, Young moving, jabbing, frustrating the former champion. As the final bell rang, Foreman knew he had lost. But the real battle had just begun. In the locker room, drenched in sweat, his body collapsing under exhaustion, Foreman felt something he had never felt before: death closing in. His vision blurred, his limbs felt like lead, and then darkness. In that abyss, something called to him. He had fought wars inside the ring, But this was a battle for his soul. Foreman gasped for air, his body drenched in sweat, his soul trapped in a void darker than any knockout he had ever suffered. This wasn't the pain of a punch, nor the exhaustion of a grueling fight. This was something else, something terrifying. As he drifted in and out of consciousness in that sweltering Puerto Rican locker room, he felt it, a force pulling him downward, an abyss opening beneath him. He saw himself slipping into a pit with no bottom, surrounded by nameless voices, their whispers laced with despair. And then, the realization struck him like a thunderbolt. This was death. And for the first time, George Foreman, the destroyer of men, the breaker of wills, felt powerless. In that moment of surrender, he reached for something he had never truly sought before. God, help me. And just like that, he was back. The darkness was gone. He sat up, gasping, his heart hammering in his chest. His trainers and doctors surrounded him, their faces twisted in worry. But George wasn't the same man. He was shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper. He looked around, his hands trembling, his body still aching from the fight. The heavyweight division, the belts, the money, none of it mattered anymore. He had spent his life searching for something, fighting for something, but now he realized what he had been missing. His entire existence had been built on rage, on the hunger to dominate, to destroy. But that hunger had led him here, to the edge of death. And in that moment, he made a decision. No more. The world of boxing watched in shock as George Foreman, still in his prime, still capable of terrorizing the division, walked away. No farewell fight, no last attempt at the title, just silence. He vanished from the spotlight, leaving behind the sport that had made him a monster. The cameras stopped rolling, the headlines moved on. But Foreman? He found himself in an entirely different fight now, not against an opponent in the ring, but against the demons he had carried for years. He traded gloves for a Bible, rage for redemption, fists for faith. The man who once reveled in fear now sought to spread something else entirely, peace. But the world had seen too many warriors fall, too many villains claim redemption, and they doubted him. Big George Foreman, a preacher, a man of God, impossible. And yet the impossible had only just begun. The world had turned its back on George Foreman, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care. The jeers of crowds, the whispers of doubters, none of it mattered now. He had spent years building an empire of fear, and now he was tearing it down, brick by brick. He walked away from the world of boxing with no regrets, immersing himself in his newfound faith. He became a preacher, standing behind a pulpit instead of within the ropes. The same voice that once growled threats in the ring now spoke of love, of salvation, of second chances. But transformation doesn't come without struggle, and Foreman's greatest opponent had never been another man. It had always been himself. The money dried up faster than he could have imagined. The millions he had earned, the fortune he had crushed men for, it was gone. Foreman, once a king, now found himself humbled, scraping to keep his ministry afloat. There were no flashy suits, no limousines, just a small church in Houston, filled with people who didn't see him as a fighter, but as a man seeking redemption. But while his faith was unshaken, reality loomed like a ghost from his past. He had a family to feed. He had bills to pay. And for all his efforts, for all his preaching, faith alone wouldn't put food on the table. The question loomed over him like a storm cloud. What now? The answer was one he had never expected. For years, he had sworn he would never return to boxing. He had buried that part of his life, left it behind in the ashes of his past. But life is never that simple. At 38 years old, with nothing left but his name, Foreman made a decision that sent shockwaves through the boxing world. Big George was coming back. The world laughed. Experts called it a joke, a relic of the past trying to relive his glory days. Impossible. He was too slow, too old, too broken. But what they didn't know was that George Foreman had already been to hell and back. And this time, he wasn't fighting for money, or power, or fear. He was fighting for something far greater, his legacy. The boxing world was merciless. It had no time for old warriors, no patience for faded legends trying to reclaim lost glory. When George Foreman announced his comeback, the reaction was swift and brutal. "He's a fool. He'll get hurt. He's embarrassing himself." The same media that once feared him now mocked him. The same fans who once roared for his knockouts now laughed at his age. But Foreman wasn't the same man who had walked away years ago. He no longer fought with anger. He no longer needed to prove his power. This time, he fought with purpose, with faith, with a fire that came not from rage, but from something deeper, something unbreakable. The first few fights were met with ridicule. His body was different now, thicker, slower, heavier. Gone was the lean, snarling predator of the 70s. Instead, the world saw a smiling, jovial giant who looked more like a preacher than a prizefighter. But when the bell rang, that smile disappeared, and the old George, the one who could crack ribs with a single punch, reminded them that power never fades. One by one, he dismantled his doubters. The knockouts returned. The doubters wavered. Maybe this wasn't a joke after all, but even as the wins piled up, the critics clung to their doubts. He's not fighting real competition. He's just padding his record. He'll never hang with the new generation. Foreman knew what they were saying. He heard the whispers, read the headlines, but he didn't care. He wasn't fighting for them. He was fighting for his own redemption, for his own unfinished story. And so he kept going, each fight bringing him closer to something greater. The momentum was shifting. The joke was turning into a possibility. The world, once so quick to mock him, now hesitated. The question began to rise. Could Big George actually do the impossible? The answer would come soon enough, in the form of a young, hungry champion named Michael Moorer. The ultimate test, the final battle, and the chance for Foreman to cement his name in history, not just as a fighter, but as a legend. The road to redemption had been long, but George Foreman was now on the precipice of something unimaginable. The world had laughed at his comeback, dismissed him as a relic of a bygone era. But now they were forced to acknowledge a terrifying truth. He was still here, still standing. And on November 5th, 1994, at 45 years old, he would step into the ring against Michael Moorer, the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. The odds were insurmountable. Moorer was young, fast, and in his prime. Foreman? He was ancient by boxing standards. The experts had already written their obituaries. Foreman is too slow. He's too old. He won't land a punch. He's walking into his own destruction. But what they failed to understand was that Foreman had already been destroyed once before. He had lost everything. And because of that, he had nothing left to fear. The bell rang, and the fight unfolded just as everyone had expected. Moorer controlled the action, snapping crisp jabs into Foreman's face, circling around the aging warrior with ease. Foreman was too slow to cut him off, too plodding to mount a real offense. But through it all, he never panicked, never wavered. He absorbed the punishment, studying Moorer, waiting. He had learned patience in his years away from the ring. He had learned that fights aren't always won in the first round, or the second, or even the eighth. He let the younger man dictate the pace, let him grow comfortable. And then in the 10th round, when the moment came, Foreman seized it like a man possessed. The right hand came out of nowhere, short, compact, and devastating. It crashed into Moorer's jaw like a sledgehammer, and the champion's legs buckled. He crumbled to the canvas, his body lifeless, his title slipping away before his very eyes. The referee counted, the crowd held its breath, and then history was made. Michael Moorer couldn't rise. George Foreman, against every odd, against every doubt, was once again the heavyweight champion of the world. 20 years after losing his title to Muhammad Ali, he had reclaimed it. As the belt was wrapped around his waist, Foreman sank to his knees in silent prayer. The world had doubted him. The world had written him off. But George Foreman had just done the impossible. The moment was surreal. As George Foreman knelt in the center of the ring, his head bowed in prayer, the world stood in stunned silence. Just minutes ago, he had been an aging contender, a relic of the past fighting against time itself. Now he was the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history. The same man who had been mocked, dismissed, and ridiculed had just rewritten the very laws of the sport. The cameras flashed, the commentators scrambled to process what had just happened, and Foreman, he simply smiled. Not the scowl of the young, angry destroyer he once was, but the smile of a man who had finally, after decades of war, found peace. But while the night was one of triumph, the battle wasn't over. Critics, unable to deny the reality of his victory, now found a new angle. Moorer was careless. It was a lucky punch. Foreman got lucky. They refused to accept what had happened, refused to acknowledge the genius behind the performance. Foreman hadn't just landed a single punch, he had set a trap. He had spent 10 rounds conditioning Moorer, lulling him into complacency, letting him believe that victory was inevitable. And then, when the moment was right, he had struck with the precision of a master assassin. There was no luck in that. That was experience. That was patience. That was the culmination of everything Foreman had learned in his journey, from the brutal streets of Houston to the darkest corners of his soul. With the championship belt around his waist once more, Foreman faced a choice. He had nothing left to prove. He had climbed the mountain, silenced the doubters, and achieved the impossible. But boxing was a cruel mistress. The sport never lets its legends walk away without one last challenge. Offers came in. Fighters called him out. The temptation to fight again, to defend his title, loomed over him like a shadow. He had gone from being a washed-up has-been to the most sought-after name in the division. But deep down, Foreman knew the truth. Every fighter eventually loses to time. The question now wasn't whether he could still fight, but whether he should. George Foreman had conquered time itself, but time never stops hunting its prey. The world still buzzed with disbelief. How had a 45-year-old man recaptured the most coveted prize in boxing? Some called it destiny, others called it madness. Foreman himself? He called it faith. But the reality was unavoidable. As much as he had defied logic, the sands of time continued to fall, and every fighter, no matter how great, must eventually answer to age. The offers came in like vultures circling a fallen warrior. Lennox Lewis, Riddick Bowe, Mike Tyson. The new generation smelled blood. They saw an old man wrapped in championship gold, a relic ripe for the taking. And for a brief moment, Foreman considered it. One last war, one last stand. But deep inside, he knew his fight had already been won. Still, the machine of boxing demanded a show. The WBA. Walking away wasn't easy. For years, the fight had been his identity. But this time, he left with something far greater than belts or trophies. He left with peace. No longer did he need to prove his dominance, to silence the doubters, to chase ghosts from his past. He had been the most feared man in boxing. He had fallen, he had risen again, and he had done it all on his own terms. The world tried to define him as just a puncher, just a relic of a different era. But he had become something no one expected, a symbol of perseverance, of faith, of second chances. He had transformed from a villain into a hero, from a destroyer into an inspiration. But George Foreman was never meant to fade into obscurity. Retirement didn't mean retreat. It simply meant reinvention. And as the years passed, the world watched in amazement as Foreman did something just as shocking as his comeback. He became a cultural icon. The scowling executioner of the 70s was replaced by a smiling, charismatic giant who won over America with warmth and humor. He launched the George Foreman Grill, a product that would sell over 100 million units worldwide, making him richer than boxing ever had. He became a businessman, a preacher, a motivational speaker. He was no longer the man who crushed opponents in the ring. He was the man who inspired millions outside of it. And yet, despite all of this success, the fire of competition still flickered deep inside him. But this time, he wasn't fighting with his fists. He was fighting for something even greater, his legacy. George Foreman had left the ring, but he had not left the fight. His war was no longer waged with gloves and knockouts, but with wisdom and resilience. He had spent his youth breaking men, shattering bones, and standing over fallen champions. Now he built, he inspired, he became a living testament to the power of reinvention. Where once he had been feared, now he was beloved. The world that once booed him now cheered his name, not because of his fists, but because of his story. The George Foreman Grill was more than just a business venture. It was a symbol of transformation. The man who once devoured steaks before fights was now selling a product designed to make America healthier. The irony was poetic. When he first signed on to endorse the grill, few believed it would succeed. But just like his second run in boxing, Foreman defied expectations. His infectious smile, his warmth, his undeniable charm, everything that had been hidden behind his scowl in his youth, now made him a marketing goldmine. Within years, the grill became a global phenomenon, selling over 100 million units and making Foreman wealthier than any title fight ever had. The joke was on those who had doubted him. He had not only conquered the ring, but also the business world. But money had never been the driving force for Foreman. Not truly. His true calling remained with people, guiding them, teaching them, sharing the lessons of his brutal, extraordinary life. He traveled the country, speaking to at-risk youth, to prisoners, to those who stood at the same crossroads he once had. He reminded them that their past did not define them, that redemption was real, that strength wasn't just about muscle, it was about the will to change. And they listened, because when George Foreman spoke, he wasn't just telling a story, he was the story. He had lived every punch, every fall, every rise, and through it all, he had become something far greater than a champion. He had become a legend. George Foreman had spent his entire life proving people wrong. He had defied the odds in the ring, defied expectations in business, and now he was shaping his final and most meaningful legacy, one of wisdom, faith, and transformation. The brutal, rage-fueled fighter of the past was gone. In his place stood a man who radiated peace, a man who had seen both the darkness of the streets and the blinding lights of glory, only to emerge on the other side as something greater than either, a man truly at peace with himself. Yet even in retirement, boxing never truly left him. He watched the sport evolve, saw young champions rise and fall, their legacies built and broken. He became a mentor, guiding fighters who sought more than just power. He told them that strength alone was never enough, that discipline, patience, and faith were the true weapons of a champion. And when the sport called upon him, he answered, not with fists, but with his voice. As a commentator, he brought his wisdom and humor to the world, offering insights only a man who had seen it all could provide. His presence reminded everyone that boxing was more than just a sport. It was a test of will, of survival, of the human spirit. But beyond boxing, beyond business, beyond the millions of grills and dollars, George Foreman's greatest wealth was found in his family. He had always fought for something: titles, revenge, redemption. Now he fought for the simplest and purest thing of all: time with his loved ones. His children bore his name, literally. Every son named George Edward Foreman, a testament to the man's belief that legacy was not in trophies, but in the mark you leave behind. He had been given a second chance at life, and he was determined to spend it wisely. No longer bound by the demons of his past, Foreman had conquered the toughest opponent he had ever faced, himself. And in doing so, he had found the greatest prize of all: legacy. It's a word fighters seldom understand until their gloves are hung, until the roars of the crowd fade into whispers. But George Foreman? He understood it better than most. His legacy wasn't just in the record books, not just in the heavyweight belts he won or the opponents he vanquished. His true legacy was in the transformation he had undergone. From a feared destroyer to a beloved mentor, from an angry warrior to a wise teacher. And through it all, he had never let the world define him. He had rewritten his own story, time and time again. Despite all he had achieved, the world still marveled at him. They had seen fighters fall from grace, seen champions crumble under the weight of their own demons. Yet Foreman had done the impossible, not just by reclaiming a title at 45, but by reclaiming himself. He had once lost everything: his pride, his faith, his will to fight. And yet here he was, Decades later, more respected, more beloved than ever. His second act in life had eclipsed his first. The world knew him not just as a boxer, but as an icon of perseverance, of resilience, of the power of redemption. And yet, despite his success, he never strayed from the foundation that saved him. He continued preaching, continued guiding lost souls the way he once had been guided. He reminded people that it was never too late to change, never too late to rise, never too late to become more. The world had known many champions, but there had never been one like George Foreman, not because of his power, not because of his titles, but because of his journey, a journey that proved that sometimes the greatest fights don't happen in the ring, they happen within, and the only true victory is finding peace. The world had watched George Foreman evolve, from a street fighter to a champion, from a villain to a hero, from a preacher to a businessman. But through all the transformations, one thing had remained constant: his will. It was the same unbreakable force that had lifted him from the streets of Houston, carried him through wars in the ring, and guided him through the storms of self-doubt and failure. And now in his later years, that willpower burned just as fiercely. Retirement didn't slow him down. It simply shifted his battlefield. He was no longer fighting opponents in the ring. He was fighting to leave something greater behind. Foreman devoted himself to philanthropy, opening youth centers and programs to help troubled kids just like he once was. He knew that had it not been for boxing, for the intervention of those who saw more in him, his life could have taken a very different path. And so he made it his mission to provide that same chance to others. He spoke in prisons, in schools, in churches. He didn't just tell his story, he lived it, breathing hope into those who had none. "You don't have to stay who you were yesterday," he often said. And those words carried weight because they came from a man who had been to the depths and climbed back up. Yet despite all his achievements, despite the millions he had made, Foreman's greatest treasure was his family. He had built an empire outside of boxing, had achieved a level of success few could ever dream of. But at the end of the day, what mattered most was the laughter of his children, the warmth of his home. He had once sought validation in belts and victories, in power and dominance. But now, he had nothing left to prove. His life had been a fight, a long, brutal, beautiful fight. And though the rounds had been tough, the knockdowns hard, he had won in the way that mattered most, by becoming the man he was always meant to be. The years rolled on, but George Foreman remained a towering presence, not just in boxing, not just in business, but in life itself. Where others faded into history, he continued to shine, his legacy growing beyond the ring. Time had once been his greatest enemy, but now he embraced it, wearing the wisdom of his years like a championship belt. He was no longer the young lion, nor the raging beast of the 70s. He was something even more powerful, an elder statesman of the sport, a living testament to the power of redemption. The sport of boxing had changed, but fighters still sought his counsel. Young champions, eager to carve their names in history, came to him not for lessons on punching power, but for lessons on survival. Foreman had lived through the highs and the lows. He had seen how boxing could build a man up and just as quickly break him, and so he told them the truth most fighters don't want to hear. It's not about how hard you hit. It's about what happens when you have nothing left, when the lights fade and the money runs dry. What will you be then? Some listened, some didn't, but all knew they were standing before a man who had lived the very lessons he preached. Even outside the boxing world, his impact endured. His name was more than just a footnote in history. It was a brand, a symbol, a story that resonated with millions. Whether through his books, his sermons, or his business empire, he had found a way to remain relevant in a world that so often forgets its champions. But for Foreman, it wasn't about fame or fortune anymore. It was about purpose. He had been given a second chance, a rare gift that few ever receive. And he would spend the rest of his days making sure that gift wasn't wasted. Because in the end, it wasn't the knockouts, the titles, or even the money that defined him. It was the man he had become. And that, more than any championship, was his greatest victory. There comes a point in every fighter's life when the cheers fade, the lights dim, and the sport moves on. But for George Foreman, the end of his boxing career was not the end of his impact. It was the beginning of something even greater. While most retired fighters struggled with irrelevance, he thrived. His presence remained larger than life, not because he chased the spotlight, but because his story had transcended the sport. He was no longer just a former champion. He was a symbol of perseverance, a testament to the idea that no fall is too great, no failure too final. His journey had been more than just a comeback story. It was a rebirth. He had gone from a young, angry kid fighting for survival to a monstrous champion fueled by destruction. He had lost everything, not just a fight, but his sense of self. And then through faith, through resilience, through sheer willpower, he had built something new, something stronger than any title. He had become more than the sum of his victories. He had become an inspiration, and that legacy stretched far beyond the ropes of the boxing ring. But as he grew older, a realization settled upon him. He had seen it all, fought it all, conquered it all. The wars in the ring had ended long ago, but the fight against time, that was one battle no man could ever win. He had once feared getting old, feared becoming irrelevant, but now he welcomed it. Every wrinkle, every gray hair was proof that he had lived, that he had endured. And in his heart, he knew his time in the ring had been legendary, but his true legacy would be measured not in knockouts, not in titles, but in the lives he had touched, the lessons he had passed down. Because in the end, glory fades, but greatness lasts forever. The weight of time sat heavily on George Foreman's broad shoulders, but it did not burden him, it crowned him. He had spent his life fighting, first for survival, then for dominance, then for redemption. Now in his later years, he fought for something far greater than gold and glory. He fought to leave behind a legacy that would outlive him, a story that would teach generations to come that no man is ever truly beaten until he chooses to stay down. The world had seen many champions rise and fall, but none quite like Foreman. He had won titles, lost them, won them again, and in doing so, had reshaped the very idea of what was possible. His journey had defied logic, his victories had defied time. But in the quiet moments, away from the cameras and crowds, he knew his greatest victory was not in the ring, it was in the life he had built beyond it. The young man who had once walked the streets of Houston, angry and lost, had become a father, a mentor, a man at peace. He had learned that true strength was not just in the fists, but in the heart. Now, as he looked at the world he was leaving behind, he knew he had done his part. His name would be etched in history, not just as a two-time heavyweight champion, but as a man who had lived 1,000 lives in one. And yet, the fight was not over. Because true legacy is not about statues or records, it's about the impact left on others. And as long as his story continued to inspire, as long as people remembered that George Foreman was a man who rose, fell, and rose again, then he would never truly fade. He had proven that comebacks are not just for the ring, they are for life itself. The echoes of George Foreman's life stretch far beyond the boxing ring. He had once been defined by his fists, by the sheer force of his power, by the destruction he left in his wake. But in the end, he was remembered for something far greater. Not the punches he threw, but the wisdom he shared. Time had taken his speed, his youth, and his place atop the heavyweight division. But what time couldn't take was the impact he had made, the lessons he had taught, the people he had inspired. He had walked away from the ring twice, but never from the fight. Even in his final years, he remained a towering figure, a source of strength for those who needed it. Young fighters sought his guidance, struggling men found hope in his words, and the world continued to see him not just as a champion, but as proof that no fall is too great, no loss too final. His journey had been one of war, but also one of peace. From a troubled street kid to a feared champion, from a fallen warrior to a man reborn. His life had been a testament to the greatest truth of all, that a man is never truly defeated until he stops fighting. And so, as the final bell tolled on his time, George Foreman's story remained immortal. Not because of his knockouts, not because of his titles, but because of his resilience. His fists had made him a champion, but his spirit had made him a legend. And as the world looked back on his legacy, one truth stood above all. George Foreman had fought, fallen, risen, and conquered. Not just the heavyweight division, not just history,